Welcome. I'm Jessica Tejan, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Evolving to Exceptional podcast. We are so excited to have another fantastic guest with us, Melanie Hiller, who's a human resource manager at Professional Environmental Engineers Incorporated. So she is actually working for a smaller organization, but she has had experience in a lot of different spaces. And I want to give you a chance, Melanie, to just kind of tell us a little bit about who you are and why you do what you do, and just give us a little bit of a background on yourself.
So yeah, like you mentioned, I am an HR manager currently with an environmental engineering consulting firm. We're about 40 or so strong. So a little on the small side, but it's manageable. So I'm not complaining. I don't come from a background of HR, and I think you and I have discussed that. But I actually had a PR degree, and I, out of college, had a hard time finding a job, switched into, recruiting, thought I would be interested in helping people find jobs and making that connection. And then I realized past that I really liked the, not only the stability of HR, and I say that in a funny way, obviously, because HR is not stable, but the stability is in the fact of everybody needs HR. So I quickly migrated into an HR manager role in manufacturing, and then that's where I'm at now.
So I before I get into just kind of talking about some general challenges, you and I kind of found you or connected with you off of a LinkedIn post that you did around the imposter syndrome. Would you be willing to share just a little bit with your perspective on that kind of challenge and maybe what you were sharing and why?
Yeah. So I think it's important to recognize kind of where it all started. So I'm a twin. So inherently there's competition, never by my sister herself. Shout out to Melissa. But, there's a lot of people, and, Jessica, you and I talked about, people, you have twins yourself, but people always compare, even though we're not comparing against each other. People are always comparing personalities, looks, all kinds of things. So I've kind of grown up in the space of just being used to being compared. So I think I some of that I've, carried into adulthood and especially into my career too. And I know I mentioned that with coming from a PR background and moving kind of into the HR space, I already felt like I was, a step behind, or like a couple steps behind when getting into the HR space. So I felt like I had a lot to prove. I still do often feel like I have a lot to prove in general, but based off of that Instagram post, I had an event at work where I got a little shaken, right? Like there was an event where, a comment was made, and I sank right back to where I was a little bit smaller, a little bit less sure of myself. And it took that to set me straight in the matter of, you're here for a reason. And that's kind of what my LinkedIn post was getting at, was you wouldn't be here, right? You wouldn't be in the job that you're at if somebody didn't see potential in you, and you do have a lot to offer, and there's a purpose for why you're here. So really just emphasizing the fact that like one setback or one moment doesn't define you, and you have so many things to give past what you think you do in that minute. So
I love that. And I think when it comes to HR, one of the things that is really challenging, and I don't know that people outside of HR realize how many elements are within that bucket. And as somebody who's like actively interviewing many people in this space, it never ceases to amaze me how many different challenges we like have to encounter or gain experience around. And so much of it is experiential, because you can't, even though you can learn like here's what to do around a sexual harassment claim, or here's what to do if there's discrimination, or here's how to handle a performance issue, or here's how to handle a termination. You can like understand it, but until you've experienced it, it's just really hard. And there's so many pieces like that. There's so many elements to to the space. And so as I think that imposter syndrome becomes even more of a challenge because it's so broad, because the bucket is so big in terms of things that we do and encounter, and especially as an HR leader in, like, where you're a solo HR leader in a smaller organization, because there isn't this big support network behind you contributing to that, to that impact. And I wonder a little bit, one of the things your post made me think about is, like, absolutely with twins, it's that much worse, right? Like the comparison piece. But we really kind of live in a culture of comparison too, where there's a lot of like inherent competition, who got which grade, who did better on what, that like someone's better and someone's lesser, rather than that everyone's kind of growing into their own unique strengths or capabilities. You wouldn't say the same thing, like, for example, about a tree. You wouldn't be like, oh, that tree isn't as tall or as good as that other tree. It would just be their different heights. They're
Mhm.
different types of trees, right? From a really basic perspective. And so I think I almost think it is like systemic in terms of a struggle that people have when it comes to taking on new roles and doing new things and feeling like you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, and everybody has that, right? Like when you're going into a new role, like it's new. Everything is new, right? So not only are you learning the business or potentially the industry that you're supporting, right? Like in HR, you support different industries. You're in the HR umbrella, but I went from manufacturing to engineering, and those two brains are very different. And yeah, it's hard to not want to compare, like, oh, this is what we did it in manufacturing, because it won't apply in engineering. So it's hard to not want to equate those two or use the same experiences. But I think that's why it's so important to constantly be in touch with where you're at and do some sort of a gap analysis often, right? Like, okay, what do I know, what do I need to know, what's a pain point, where's a potential place that I can grow. So I think as an HR person, you kind of owe it to your staff to be like, no, I'm still growing here too, and I'm still interested in making sure I'm being the best for you. So but yeah, I would definitely recommend those gap analysis or those quick check-ins with yourself, because I think that's the only way kind of when to raise your hand, right?
Yeah.
Instead of saying, I've got all the answers, like, of course it's this, and being wrong. So I feel pretty strongly here. However, there's more research that I need to do, because that's not something that I've, come across. Kind of similar to what you mentioned about that sexual harassment or discrimination. Like, yeah, you can run through as many, SHRM scenarios as you want, but they're always going to be different, right? Because there's different humans on the other end. So different behaviors.
Well, you know what that makes me think of is that there's different humans, but there's emotion. So when you learn how to do it
Mm-hmm.
and what to do, it doesn't take into account the emotions you're going to experience when you do
No.
it.
Yeah.
And that can be some of the hardest parts, especially in HR, because you do end up tending to deal with a lot of hot button, challenging, dramatic, like there's lots of crises kind of, situations that come up. So I love that you said that about the challenges and what people experience.
It's on both sides too, right? Like, you're not only like trying to mitigate how, unknown the situation is for the employee, but then you also have the employer being like, okay, no, like, we need to make sure we're doing everything correct and we're not setting ourselves up for something that could get us in trouble. Like, it's a very, very it's a very tough liaison spot to be in HR sometimes. And I always think about like the funny saying of like how they say human resources, and they say like lawyer, psychologist, teacher, like
Right.
you're expected to be so many things at once and be the expert of all of it. So
Well, and that's what we like love about it, and like partially why we do it, and it's like the biggest struggle. And the other thing you said a minute ago that I think was really powerful is like our continuing to learn and grow. And sometimes I think we're so busy in HR space supporting the organization or the other resources
mhm.
that we don't always like make that possible for ourselves. And some of the best support I ever had, I was really lucky in my early career when I was starting out and building an HR function for the first time, to have this network of other HR leaders who were like in similar businesses, that we were able to like collaborate together and work together on both program development, but also I could go to them for like, here's what I'm struggling with. And because often in HR, when you encounter something, it is sensitive, it is confidential, it's like, so there's not even a good outlet for where to kind of deal with those challenges or those situations. And I kind of jokingly say that my biggest career mistake was not getting like a formal coach or somebody who could support me earlier in my career,
Yeah.
because that was like something I struggled with a lot, because it's lonely when it's just you.
Yes. I made sure I'm obviously very aware that I do have a good support system at my job. I'll say that. Like I have people who pitch in and help where they can. But yeah, I did realize I was acutely aware of the fact that I was a single person in a department. So I connected with the SHRM chapter locally, and I obtained a mentor, and we meet, at least once a month, and he's there that I can like shoot him an email and be like, what's going, like, what would you do in this situation? Or like, hey, do you have any resources, in this space? And I also have, with working with other companies, I've had other less formal mentors or people that
Yeah.
I really look up to in the HR space. So I do feel very fortunate that I made that a priority early in my career, that I do have a very solid group of people I can run things past.
I think that's so brilliant of you to proactively take those steps. And if I were like speaking to anybody in HR or anybody in an organization that, and maybe even more so in an organization that doesn't have anybody, and where like the owner or the founder is like kind of carrying that burden, is to get that outside support, to get that make those connections, because there are so many scenarios you're going to run into, and if you already have those connections or those support locations, it's going to make a big difference. I love that. Let's talk a little bit about some of the biggest challenges you've encountered in your current organization that you've been, maybe struggling with or had to focus on.
Yeah, so I know you and I had spoke previously about it's just you're coming into a space, and I know obviously you know the history, but just to get everyone else up to speed, like my company that I'm supporting has been around for 25 years. They had only had an HR person for 2 out of the 25 before I got there, and I've made up the last year, so 3 total. But when you have, an organization that's at that maturity level as a small business, and then no HR to support it, you kind of like, tilt your head like, how did you do it? Like, how did you maintain this? And the truth of the matter is they maintained, legal compliance where necessary, but like a lot of the other more strategic pieces around HR or some of the processes used a lot of work, but like obviously everybody else is doing a million other jobs. So yeah, that would be the biggest struggle is getting in. And they did a really, really good job of prepping me and saying, hey, it's going to be a lot of work. We've got a lot of, like, you will never be bored. And so far they have not let me down on that. But I enjoy being, obviously really busy, but yeah, there's a lot to kind of build from the ground up, and they've all been incredibly supportive. My supervisor and the president have been supportive of kind of some of my more unorthodox ideas, or some things where I'm like, hey, let's try this, or like, why are we doing it this way? Like they're very patient and understanding with when I question things. And I'm like, hey, like, let me know what was in your head at this point, or like, why did we do this, or could we try this? So it's the initial culture shock of, oh, this is going to be a lot of work, but it's been fun.
I love that approach of asking questions. I think often when we start building, like, and we come into HR and we come into a new organization and we're trying to build, it's easy to like cast a lot of judgment and be like, you know, like this does not make sense. We should not be doing it this way. And I think your approach of like asking like what made us do this or why is this way, especially in an organization that's existed for a long time. It's kind of like when you have small organizations, they fall into two buckets. One is they're a startup, so they haven't grown yet. And they're maybe growing, or two, they've been around, but they haven't they've figured out how to manage without having to go through big enough growth that would require the HR, like an active HR function or person in that role. And so when you have that situation, you've got to build the new practices in, like you're talking about, into an organization that's figured out how to operate without them. And so it's not as though they're like, "Hey, help me. How do we do this for the first time ever?" It's, "Hey, we're doing this just fine. Are you sure we need to do that?" Kind of thing. And there's some changes I think that tend to be more receptive, like recruitment and hiring or
Mhm.
things like that, where they really see the need. And then there's other areas, typically the more strategic and impactful areas, that maybe there's more resistance around. Has that been your experience?
Yes, yes. And I think too, they had some, some systems and things like that in place. They just needed, I'd never heard the word clunky before before I got there. They'd use the adjective clunky, like, oh, our processes feel clunky. So it was a matter of like, okay, I'm gonna sit back and I'm gonna digest and consume the process the way it is, and I'm gonna watch it and see where there's potentially a better way to do it. But then also being really receptive and saying like what has worked for you or what hasn't worked for you, right? Because I'm some new person. Like if I come in and I overhaul the whole process, then they're going to be like, okay, you don't know us, you don't know, like
Right.
we assume you know what you're doing because we hired you, but you really have no like skin in the game, no conviction to like, no, you want to trust me while I do this, or like here's why I'm doing it, without like meeting them on that level first, right? Like if
Yeah.
you were to come in and start swinging, metaphorically, or you know what I mean, start knocking down all these things that they have worked, that has worked for them in the past, that's going to be really jarring. So yeah, identifying, okay, what's the biggest pain point for us to tackle here, and then saying, okay, I'm going to observe, like I'm going to active listen and actively pay attention to how you guys are doing it now. And I think then you can speak from a point of perspective, right? You can speak and say, hey, I noticed we did this, instead of saying like, I haven't seen you do it at all, but I'm going to assume it's done wrong, right? So,
Mhm.
but yeah, as far as that, yeah, the more, I think I told you too, like we call them fluffy term, like fluffy ideas over in my neck of the woods. Just the more like psychological safety. Like if it's a business that's been around for 25 years that hasn't kind of felt that organic growth into some more of those fluffy or really really important spaces such as DE&I, or neurodiversity and mental health, like
Yep.
that jump feels very large, especially from if the majority of your staff comes from a generation where that wasn't, it wasn't at the forefront, like help for stuff like that wasn't accessible. You do feel you feel a little bit of tension there too. But like I said, I've been very grateful to have the staff that I have, and most of the time I think they trust me, and I hopefully am approachable enough to have a conversation on why it may feel like there's a little tension there.
Well, you make such a good point too, because even as a like HR professional and like somebody who's been in this space and studies this space and everything, it's hard to keep up with um, the trends, the research, the best practices. So much. I think probably 100% of talent management, like related things, have changed in some way
Yeah.
in the last decade, from where, best practice was performance reviews with competencies and ratings and, or even forced rankings within companies. That was like standard practice,
Mm-hmm.
to like studies showing the ineffectiveness of that on actual performance results. So there's just so much new information. And psychological safety, that wasn't even like a term in the context of the workplace at all. And in some cases, like companies are still trying to come up to speed on like physical safety,
Yeah.
let alone psychological safety. Like that's still a hurdle and a challenge. And so I think that's where to come in, even if there had been some things in place, you can't possibly be up to date on your awareness of, or even, or, you know, the importance, why it matters, how to bring it in, how to do it right in an organization where there's nobody focused on it? How did you decide where to maybe focus your efforts and begin to build, or begin to ask those questions and make suggestions or changes or additions to what they were doing before?
Yeah, I think again it goes back to that active listening piece of like, okay, what to you seems like the biggest, and then like really sitting with that and identifying after, getting your feet wet. Okay, does this feel like the biggest, but it is the biggest, or does it feel like the biggest and it's not the biggest? Like we're looking at the wrong, we're on the wrong path here. But again, I think you can't identify that, or you can't do that if you don't listen, if you're not, willing to understand who you're now supporting. But yeah, it was a matter of like I said, sitting with that and then identifying, okay, like, hey, here's a piece that's maybe a pain point or kind of holding us back or may not be representing us in the best way, during onboarding or orientation, or like, hey, do you think about like, or have you thought about maybe switching this, or, stretching it out to 2 days. So that way it's not a 1-day process and then we're, feeding them to the wolves. Like, so it's just a matter of suggesting of things of like, not only from the facilitation side of the onboarding and orientation, I'm using that one as an example, but also from the employee side. Like I sat in and I did a lot of like retroactive, obviously I wasn't here, but how was your onboarding experience? Or, if you could suggest something different, what would it be? And we did it in a really like non-formal way over a lunch, because nobody's going to say no to a lunch, right? Like, so we bought them lunch and we just chatted, right? Like we just talked, like, what could we have done better? Or like, and I approached it very much in the way of like, hey, I'm the new person, educate me, right? Like rather than being like so uncomfortably stiff on, I'm going to come in and I'm going to be the HR person that asks you like, rate your experience 1 to 5. I did it in a much more conversational way. And I think that, if anything, just poised me to be more approachable in general, like here, which is so, so important as an HR person. You don't want to be the person that they only see when they're in trouble. I obviously like put a huge emphasis on being somebody that can partner with the staff that I have, because I want to be the person that they can come to before they get into my chair with something that's kind of irreversible, unfortunately. So I think, again, I'm going to keep repeating myself, but listening and meeting people where they're at.
So it sounds like the kind of area though that you focused in first was that onboarding, recruitment, hiring piece. Is that kind of where you targeted as you were coming in to start like optimizing kind of that space first?
It was, yes, because that was one of the issues that they had noticed was the biggest pain point for them, but also like we were growing. So it was like, we're not going to get away from this. So we might as well make a system that that's going to benefit us, something that's going to serve us well. So if we know we're going to hire a lot of people, then that seemed like a major focus.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. I think that's common, where it's like that first, the almost the reason that HR finally gets brought in is that recruitment and hiring and onboarding become overwhelming. I remember when I started, the executive assistant at the time was doing that function, the executive assistant to the president, and she said to me like, if I do not transition this, I'm quitting. Like, I'm done. I'm not doing it anymore. Like, it was just overwhelming. And when I stepped in, I mean, now this was like 15 years ago. So, like, we were still like faxing background checks and ridiculous things like that.
Right.
So like there was no automation, there was no tools, there was, none of those things. And so, which makes me sound like way older than I actually am. I think the company just wasn't that progressed, but, I think that when it comes to starting the HR function, I think that's like usually where we start, and it does bring a lot of value. It's just it can then become challenging to get off of that, off of just doing interviewing, hiring, onboarding, like the like day-to-day tactical,
Yep.
to get the bigger things that are going to really create greater retention, improve performance of people, all those kinds of things. It makes it harder to get to those elements.
Right. I think I had mentioned, I started to notice that I was checking some boxes my first 30 days, which, like I said, it was a little aggressive probably on my end to be like, all right, 30 days in, like, you've got to do a million things. Like I could have um, I could have sat with that a little longer, but I truly did, because I chose the job I did because it was a much more of a bigger picture, like strategic type role, because that's the piece that I love, right? Like recruiting and talent management will do it to you, right? Like
Yes.
I don't fault that executive assistant at all, because you're either cut out for it or you're not. Like either you love it or you do it because you have to, as part of your job. But and I obviously fall in the latter category. So I actually sat down with my supervisor and I said, hey, like, I want to have a chat about kind of what I'm doing here. I feel like right now I'm checking a lot of boxes, and I know that I don't, you know, I don't undermine the importance of it at all, because I think it is incredibly important, but I just want to make sure that we're aligned on the same path moving forward, that I want to see significant growth and change here. And I want to be the one to help implement that. So yes, I will continue to focus on recruiting, because I know, your people are your backbone of your business, but I also don't want to lose sight of some of these other things that will, keep the people, will keep the backbone, right?
Yes, 100%. So here's one of my favorite questions to ask, which is, what is that, maybe strategic focus area or thing that if you were able to bring it to your business, or that if you did it, it would really help or support your business the most? Like, what is it that would, right now, just kind of knowing where your organization's at, what is it that you'd most like to bring at this point?
Yeah, I think I have a personal passion within like mental health and psychological safety and connection. So anything involving that. I mean, I spoke to the president of our company, and I sometimes I think he doesn't actually roll his eyes. He's very patient with me, but I think sometimes he's like, "Are you sure?" Like I'll say something, I'm like, "No, like supervisor and direct report connection is really important these days," and it's like, "Well, yeah, it is, but not to the extent that kind of the newer generation is looking for." So it's a matter of saying, like, we're going to head to that direction. So let's pay attention to how we can better support our staff, just like even past what they do, 40 hours a week. Like, let's get to know them as people. And I think it's funny too, because sometimes now he'll be like, oh, so I was talking to my son and I heard this, and he had mentioned that, a relationship with his supervisor is a reason why he wants to leave. And I'm like, well, like, so I think, yeah, if I could do anything strategic, it'd be more education around the mental health, psychological safety, relationship building piece, which is, again, more of the fluffy stuff, but the very, very important stuff.
It's interesting. When we I think I might have said this before, but when we talk about fluffy stuff, it's usually the hardest stuff, and that's why we kind of don't want to deal with
Mm-hmm.
it. And I love the comment about how much do managers really have an impact. Gallup talks about that managers are 70% of the variance on employee engagement, so that's a huge factor.
Yeah.
And then there was recently a study, and I would have to try to look for it, but I know it struck me as really, really powerful. And I can't remember whether it was Gallup or not, but where they found that like having a bad manager has the same impact on you as a spouse.
Oh,
So
okay.
like it is equivalent to your spouse, the impact that your manager has on you, and on your life. And that to me was, I mean, it makes sense because of how much time we spend, with and
Mm-hmm.
working for our managers and everything. Certainly I have felt that effect before in my past of like how much a challenging manager or leader can impact your overall well-being and performance. That's staggering, right? Like that highlights why leadership and manager development is so critical. And I'm not sure that many business owners realize how much money they leave on the table
Mm-hmm.
when they're not taking action in that space. It seems like it's like an extra or nice to have, and they
Oh,
don't recognize that like it's literally impacting your bottom
yep.
line every
Yep.
day.
I think too, like it's we've talked about chief doers versus people who are actually like meant to lead. And I think like having that good relationship, or having somebody who knows how to like harness that good relationship energy or the good leadership, has obtained those good leadership skills, like they're your eyes and ears, right? Like for your HR, like if they have a good relationship with their staff, like it gives you nothing but information, right? Your staff will be more comfortable to come to you and say, hey, like, I don't like what I'm working on, or hey, I'm having a really hard time. So like it's all it does by you putting a little bit, like pouring a little bit more into your people, is you get ahead of a lot of the things. So not only like are you, you're catching it ahead of time so you can maybe kind of change the course on that and get them to where they're, in a happier spot where they're better understanding of their job. You're stopping them from leaving, right? Like people don't like to leave good managers. I know I stayed way longer than I should have at some of these other, some of the other roles that I had because I really respected my manager. And then there's some I didn't stay very long for the opposite reason, is because that partnership wasn't there. So yeah, to your point with your statistic, like I'm surprised, but I'm not, right? Like I think it plays a big, big role in why you choose to stay or why you don't, right? Like I think you have to inherently feel like someone's in your corner, right?
Yes.
So if you don't have that, or they're, and somebody has your interest or your best interest on succeeding, if they're just somebody to like monitor you while you clock in and clock out, that's transactional, right? That's not a connection that you need to be able to stick around and stick it out.
Well, and it makes a huge part of the reason I think it makes such a huge impact on performance is that when people feel comfortable enough to have those conversations with their manager regularly, now you mitigate some of that drag on performance results and what people are accomplishing. And really in an ideal scenario, I think HR has kind of gotten a bad rap in the past because it was seen as like, I mean, my old organization we didn't use the term HR, and they used to refer to HR as like the complaint department and wouldn't let me
Yeah.
use that term. We always used talent management instead, because that used to be like, oh, employees go complain to HR, go tell them your grievances, your problem, whatever. But that's not really the HR or the people and performance practices of today. And the best place for an employee to go when they have an issue is to their direct manager. And if that manager is equipped with how to help coach them, walk them through that challenge, and develop the skill sets that they need, then you're going to reduce that drama and you don't have people going to HR with some of the ridiculous things that can come up occasionally, and instead they're focused on executing the business and making a difference, because I think most people come to work wanting to do a good job. Like they don't come like starting out like, hey, I'm starting this new job so that I can screw it up. Like that's not like where most people are coming from. And so it's more so that leader, that manager, or that the frustration builds, and there's not that communication and there's not that understanding.
Yeah, I actually saw a video that stuck with me on TikTok. This girl had posted like a clip of her the day before and was like, I'm really excited. I've got a performance review, I can't wait. I can't wait to hear what their feedback is. And the next day she, did a similar clip but she was obviously distraught. It was like, just an FYI, like performance reviews should not be a surprise. Like the feedback you get should not be a surprise at a performance review. And I think the street works both ways, right? Like if you build that relationship and build that connection, your employees are more likely to be honest with you. And like I said, raise a white flag should they need to where you can kind of redirect the business with way less drag, like you mentioned. But also you as a supervisor can say, hey, like I'm noticing things are off. And then you get ahead of them before they mentally check out and now are actively working against the business without realizing it, right? By just, just showing up, but not producing or providing, good work. So
Yeah. Absolutely. And I love what you said there. And I have an employee that used to say, be kind to your future self. That's what she would always tell managers. Be kind to your future self. Because if you do the right performance practices, if you do the right expectation setting and feedback as you're going, then there aren't those surprises. And we used to do something, we had something called a compensation conversation. And so we had guides that managers had to fill out in order to get to put in for a compensation increase. And they would have to say why the employee was aligned with core values, what they had demonstrated in terms of performance, and how they had developed and grown additional skill sets and capabilities. And often we would have managers that would really struggle early on to be able to do that. And
Mhm.
they learned, oh, if I'm setting expectations all along and we're having these conversations, then it makes it really easy because I can look back at that and be like, oh, look, they accomplished these 10 goals. Oh,
Mhm.
look, they developed these 3 skill sets that we laid out. And now you're able to recognize that progress because you help to set out what that progress looks like. And so I think you're right. I think, it should never come as a surprise in a performance review or performance conversation how a person is doing. And when it does, there's a real negative impact to that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you lose that trust, right? Because I can imagine the girl on TikTok was like, I obviously thought this was going to go way different. So then you lose trust in your manager because it's like, okay, how long has it been like this that you didn't mention it, right? Like you owe it to both people to say, hey, like things are going like we're going off the rails a little bit here. And I don't know if it's a matter of supervisors are, like I said, good at what they're doing, but they just lack that conflict resolution or lack like how to deliver tough information. But it's going to only get worse, right? Because you're either going to catch the employee off guard or it's going to amount to something so massive that now it is a big deal. And back to your drama, like anything we can do to mitigate the drama that comes our way in HR is gold. But yeah, I do find like virtually every job that I've been at, there's some managers that are able to confidently give that feedback, and there's some that don't, and then it ends up biting them more often than not.
Well, and I think you raise a good point in that there's so much struggle. There is a lot of struggle with giving difficult feedback or how to have those conversations or address conflict directly. And what I believe to be true is that there's a lack of self-awareness. There's an element of self-awareness that's required to be able to engage in those conversations in effective and healthy ways where they have strong outcomes or positive outcomes. And so the experience that people have had is that when they've been direct or they've addressed conflict, it has created pain of some sort. It has created, either blowback or disagreement or the person quit or something happened there where, dealing with conflict is now considered bad or is programmed kind of into them as something that doesn't feel good and doesn't
Yeah.
have good outcomes. And so in order to change that behavior, in order to change that way of operating, a person has to actually become more self-aware and more conscious of what's happening inside of them and the other person in order to engage in healthier ways. And unfortunately, I think most people are not trained on that. And even if they've been trained in some, I mean, there's so many different, like, how to give feedback,
Yeah.
how to deal with conflict types of trainings, they don't go inward enough to help people actually make those changes. They're just this like external step-by-step process or way to do something, and there's still the resistance to actually doing it.
Yep. I think there's a nuance too with like how to do it, right? I think most times they're like, okay, well, you did this thing and it was bad. All right, let's move on. But I think like my almost foolproof plan is like, again, realizing they're human on the other end and say, okay, like obviously you may or may not know why we're here. Like, tell me like what's going on, or like, I want to hear what's going on your side. Or like, I think oftentimes, like if you, especially if it's like a performance issue, you don't know, like, I always tell everybody, like, think, you know, 2 steps back, like 2 steps back, right? Like, what could have got them to this point to where maybe performance is lacking. And I think when you have that understanding and you give a little bit more grace there, I think that makes you easier to talk to in situations like that. Of like, okay, like, hey, I don't know what's going on. Like explain to me in your words, like how we got here, and then every question you have after that of like what can we do to support you, right? Even if it's
Mm.
something that's completely an issue that is self-driven on their end, how can we support you better? Like obviously this isn't working, like is there something we can be doing? I think if you, instead of saying you,
Yes.
that automatically, like, people just whoop, they shut down. So
100%. Yes.
yeah.
Yes, you are head on, head on with the you, right?
Yep.
You need to do this differently. The shared responsibility, the what can I do better, that approach completely changes the conversation. And especially I find when I come into it with that, or when I've come into a conversation with, maybe I'm not being clear enough, maybe I'm not setting expectations or giving you enough feedback. I I'm not, and focusing on, I think, the outcome, or the rather than the person. I'm not pleased with this presentation,
Yep.
or this project didn't get executed smoothly, because those are factual statements,
Yep.
rather than like, you didn't do a good job running the project. Okay, the project didn't run smoothly. What do you
Mhm.
think happened? Like you were saying, like giving them a chance to provide that input, because if they can have the insight about themselves and what they were lacking or what they didn't do and should have done, that's going to create a better learning than if you tell them what they should have done.
Yeah, especially like we had talked about, like if you say, okay, what could we have done differently? Like, could we have supported you differently? I think a lot of times they're like, could they have? No, actually, like this part was my bad, and I think they when you do some more of that, like 360 understanding of like, okay, no, there was a lot of pieces here, but like that probably was my bad. But if you could help me, do X, Y, Z in the future, I think I'd be better supported to do better in this. I often talk about like communication currency. Like you could be saying this thing, but it's just not transferable. Like this person has no, like they're not consuming in the way you mean it. So
Right.
I think it's super important to check in and say like, hey, like these are the instructions. Does that make sense? Or can I be clearer? Rather than saying these are the instructions, this is how I'm comfortable giving it to you. But I don't know how how you digest information or how you consume
Right.
information. So I think you're only doing yourself a disservice by not asking those questions and not being more aware of, okay, this person may think differently, or this person may prefer written notes or like
Yeah.
visual notes versus me saying it verbally. But I've only ever done it verbally, and my staff, aside from this one person, can handle it verbally. So I think it goes back to that self-awareness thing. Is you have an added responsibility not to just manage the people, but to manage overall, right? Like to understand overall how to do what you're doing best.
The other thing that's important is that managers know that that's their responsibility. And I think sometimes there's this belief that my employee is responsible for what they're supposed to do. And if they don't do it, that's their problem. And I'm supposed to tell them that they're not doing it,
Hmm.
rather than looking at the work that the people that you manage, what they're producing is all your responsibility as the manager. And so, as a manager, either I'm able to help you to be successful, or I have to navigate you out and someone else into the organization, because that is my responsibility. And I think sometimes it's easy to point fingers at the employee or blame. I certainly was guilty of that earlier in my career, where I was like, you screwed this totally up. I can't believe you did this. And wasn't as conscious of saying, hey, maybe I wasn't clear enough. Maybe I didn't give enough guidance. What are we going to do different?
Yeah.
Because this isn't working, because this output is not an acceptable output. I wonder a bit how many managers are more of the mindset of, like, I'm just here to dole out work, and not
Hmm.
that you actually own the work of the people that you're managing. And that's an expectation I think the organization has to set, that that's part of those organizational norms or expectations, so that managers know that's part of the duty, or that's part of their responsibility.
Yeah, I think you have so many pieces that, like you said, that you're responsible for. That if you don't have a pulse on all of that, then you're not doing your job, right?
Right.
Right, like
Right.
then that's something that we need to be paying further attention to. Like to your point, you can't just do the job and assume and just like delegate work but not have any attachment to what's being produced. Like make it make sense. But I think being a supervisor is a way bigger job than most people realize.
100%. I always say that when I have new hires who want to be managers someday. well, we'll see. We'll see what you think about that later on. So my last question, and then we'll wrap this up, is what is it you most need as an HR leader? Is there something that really would bring you value as an HR leader in the workplace today?
I think I joked with you earlier, more time to do everything. Again, being a team of one with really good support, but mainly a team of one. I just wish I could maintain more work with the same amount of time, which obviously is not a thing. So it's just a matter of obviously creating those really healthy boundaries and getting done what you can, and being really, really communicative of that, of, hey, here's what I can focus on and prioritize, and here's what may be taking, the back burner, but being on the same page with your supervisor on what that looks like. That and I hesitate to say more understanding that HR is your friend.
I think that's a great note. For everybody out there, a reminder: we do HR because we actually really care about people. I would say 99% of us do. I'm sure there's exceptions, but that our interest is to really make a difference in the organization, especially for the people in the organization. That's why most of us ended up in this space, whether we chose that path or just found our way there. And I will say, I do think it's possible to optimize your performance. I think you have to look at energy rather than just time. And if you can more effectively manage your energy and how you're applying yourself, you actually can get more time back and you will be able to accomplish more. But most people allow that time hurdle to stop them rather than figuring out new ways to get better. So for those that take the time to really grow and expand their capacity, those are the people that really experience that success and kind of push through those boundaries. So any final comments or thoughts from you as we wrap up today's episode?
Just going back to being, that person with imposter syndrome, I think it's so important to be able to find you're brave, right? I think knowing, like I said, that you have a purpose for being here and you have a purpose for doing the work that you're doing, be able to find something that gives you a little puff to your chest, and go in with confidence and do your research and make sure that obviously what you're bringing to the table is something you fully vetted, but also be really, really confident what you have to bring.
I love that. I think that is very powerful. And it's a good reminder for anybody that might be experiencing that imposter syndrome, and just to know you're also not alone. So thank you, Melanie, so much. It was a great conversation. I'm so grateful that you came on the show today. As always, I like to remind our listeners to just remember to always keep evolving and growing, and you will live that exceptional life.